Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, as well as the internet and BCTV. I want to welcome Emilie Kornheiser to the show, as well as John Walters from Vermont Digger, and I am your host, Olga Peters. John, it is so good to see you after weeks and weeks of not seeing you.
Or seeing anybody.
Well, there's that.
Except on little tiny, boxes on your computer monitor.
Yeah, I'm starting to call this time, instead of COVID-19, like the resurgence of the Brady Bunch, because I feel like we're all just in little boxes. Mm-hmm. Too bad we couldn't sing.
I think it's
Emilie,
best.
Emilie, the next time you have a committee hearing, you should get everybody to sing the Brady Bunch at the beginning.
Yes, we did try to vote simultaneously yesterday, and if that was any indication, I think singing is not a great idea.
Well, speaking of the legislature, for those who don't know John Walters, he writes for 7 Days, which is headquartered in Montpelier. Oh my gosh!
I make that mistake sometimes too. I used to write for 7 Days, and I write for VT Digger now.
VT Digger now.
Yeah.
Thank you for catching me on that. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. And he has been one of the State House reporters for the Digger. And I'm curious, for both Emilie and John, this time of year, if we did not have COVID-19, the legislature would be dealing with some of the end of the session, big budgets. We'd be talking about how many more weeks are left in the session. Will they finish before April? Blah, blah, blah. And of course, that whole kind of tradition has been blown out of the water. So for both you, John, and you, Emilie, what's happening as far as the legislature is concerned right now? Where are you at in adapting to all this COVID?
Well, in terms of reporting, we are just trying to keep track of everything online. We are all in our homes. We are all, signing into, various committee hearings and when the House is in session digitally, as they did for the first time on Thursday. We are watching from our workspaces in home. In terms of the situation for the legislature, Emilie may have more insight than I do, but it's completely up in the air right now because under normal circumstances, you have to finish the budget and all that stuff by the end of June in order, to meet the constitutional requirements, and you finish all the other legislation sometime, hopefully in April or early May, and then you're done for the year. And this is a campaign season. So then everybody's attention turns to the election campaign, and particularly for candidates who have primaries. The primary is in August. So you have a fairly quick campaign season until the primary. And now I think leadership is talking about, finishing up the COVID-related bills and doing a sort of a patch and fill budget for the first 3 months of the new fiscal year. And then coming back in the summer, maybe in August, to finish off, to try to do a budget for the rest of the year, because right now we have no idea what state finances are going to look like. And from my perch as the political columnist, that really throws a wrench into the works, because the primary is in August. If the legislature's in session in August, that'll create some very interesting conflicts for a lot of people who are not only office holders, but candidates. Primary among them would be Senate President Pro Tem Tim Ashe, who is running for Lieutenant Governor, and Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman, who is running for governor. They're going to be on the job when normally they would be campaigning. So that's just the political angle of this, which I know nobody is thinking about right now.
Oh, I don't think no one's thinking about
it. Just in terms of the lawmaking aspect of it, it's really up in the air right now.
Well, and I want to just highlight what you said about the overlap between the primary and if the legislature in session. It's kind of a bigger deal because there's an unspoken rule in the state house that you're
Yeah.
not supposed to even think about campaigning or talk about campaigning or announce your campaigning before the end of the session. Not everyone follows that, but that is kind of the unspoken rule. So yeah, it's another Ripon tradition, I guess.
And to
I
add
guess,
another piece to that, because we will very likely, and the Secretary of State is sort of very close to saying more publicly, has been saying it casually, if the primary is going to be 100%, mail-in ballots, that every house will be mailed a ballot, and you can go to your polling place if you want for some reason, or if you need to for some reason, but it'll be mail-in ballots. That voting starts in June.
Right.
That's 45 days before the primary. And so if people normally, and that's always true, but that's just for people who get it together to request a ballot that far in advance. If they're all being delivered to people's houses that early, then people are likely voting that early. And that's a completely different campaign season, even if we were recessed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, I have been talking with House candidates. I'm going to be writing a column next week about particularly first-time House candidates. Emilie has kind of an advantage because she's an incumbent and people are aware of her, and she's got the name recognition of incumbency, and hopefully a track record that people will like. But if you're running for legislature for the first time and you can't go door to door, and you can't hold forums, and it's really tough for those people. And it's, again, for office holders who are being challenged in primaries, they're going to have to choose between campaigning and actually serving. If the legislature takes a break between whenever they finish the 3-month budget and come back for the 2021 budget, there probably still going to be plenty of meetings. And as Emilie can tell you, tons and tons of constituent calls. So, the office holders are going to be really busy.
Mm-hmm.
So the timeline that we're talking about, and so crossover normally happens the week after town meeting week, which was in March.
Which
I've
is
really super lost track of everything,
ago.
right? I actually was looking at my calendar the other day to be like, how many weeks have I been doing this inside my house? So crossover was in March. We actually came home and recessed on Friday the 13th, which is, I remembered that the other day and I was like, oh good, I can actually keep that in my head. And so that was supposed to be crossover. Crossover was suspended because we spent a week focused in the building on COVID related bills. But then when we came back home to work remotely, the Senate really the House moved more quickly with our initial COVID legislation, but then the Senate actually remarkably transitioned to their electronic lives much more quickly because they're a much smaller body and they can be more flexible. And so the House has been operating in a fairly slower capacity than normal lately. And so we spent more than a month without doing any votes on the House floor. And we did that for the first time yesterday. And the committees have also been moving a lot more slowly, partly because of limited IT capacity. We don't want to have too many committees going simultaneously because our IT staff can't handle it. And we need a lot of IT support because many legislators, a lot of this is really brand new to them. Operating their iPad is really brand new to them, which is it's one of the sort of themes I'd like to come back to about professional development for legislators, operating in an office environment, but that's a conversation for another day.
I've written it down though.
Okay. And so we've had this whole month where we've been working much slower without voting and with very limited information. So we're talking about spending this month passing COVID-related and COVID response legislation, and then hypothetically having another month or so where bills that had met the suspended crossover timeline could move through. And so not everything that we spent the last year and a half working on will just fall through the cracks into dust. But because of the new rules for how we vote in the House, controversial bills will likely not surface because we need more agreement in order to bring something to the floor.
What are some of the controversial bills? I have completely forgotten all about controversial bills.
Like there's some domestic violence legislation that involves some firearms. That's one that was voted out of committee right before this all happened. That's just one example. There's other stuff. There's a bill that passed out of House Human Services unanimously that was about buprenorphine, which is still quite controversial, even though it was voted out unanimously. Things like that will just involve a lot of Brattleboro's own charter change around the youth vote, which I really hustled very hard to get out of committee in time, and I am very sad is not going to probably ever make it to the floor. So things like that. And so we're going to spend a month like that. And then we do have the money bills to pass, but we have so little information about how much money we have and how much money we will have, partly because we don't understand all of the complexities of the CARES Act, because no one does. A law was passed and a lot of the guidance around it has not been figured out yet. So don't want to spend money and then wind up owing it back to the federal government. And so trying to figure out some of the rules there. So don't know how we can spend that money. Also, we're not clear because tax dates were pushed out. We're not clear how much that money will actually come in and how much of it is lost forever. So we could call it deferred revenue because that's technically what it is. But estimating what that deferred revenue is fairly difficult because it's possible that some people, even though they're holding on, technically they should be holding that money because it is, a lot of it's taken sort of as a trustee of the state. So sales tax is received, the person's a trustee of the state. It's not the property of the person who's collected it. Some of that might not come to the state. And then there's also just all of the lost revenue. We're not spending at least I'm not spending anywhere near as much money as I usually do. And I think that's true for a lot of people. And then lost income tax, of course, but that's further out. So we have no idea how much money we have or how much money we will have. And so we might pass a limited budget bill and then come back again and pass sort of a new longer one. So pass just a quarter, 3 months worth of budget and then come back in August. It's also not clear, and I know it's not very popular or political to talk about this. It's not clear how we're going to get paid for that time.
Right.
Which is another one of the nuances of the citizen legislature. So I have a job, and my job is brilliant and flexible and wonderful in that it allows me to switch between part-time and fuller time. And it even allows me to come back for town meeting break and work full-time that week. But we're trying to do our budget at work information environment, financial environment. And I have no idea when I'll be able to come back to work full time. There's rumors from the Senate Pro Tem that I think were in a Digger article about how we likely won't get paid for the work we do in August. And I don't understand how I will have time to do that work if I'm not getting paid, because if I'm not getting paid for my legislative work, I need to be working my other job so that I can pay my bills. And just like a total lack of information or transparency around all of that nuance is very difficult to plan for, and is much easier for folks who don't need another job to plan for because they can stay open and flexible. Some of them have had to cancel their vacations, but they probably would have had to cancel their vacations anyway because airlines are funny right now. And so that's a really interesting piece about all of this uncertainty, is that uncertainty about how we're even going to be doing our jobs in the future. So
that is such a theme. I was talking to someone this week about unemployment insurance because that's just an article I'm working on right now. And that was one of the key things for her, is just the uncertainty and the lack of information. She's like, I know the Department of Labor is trying, but I filed, but I don't know if I'm in the right category. I don't know if my file went through. I don't know when my money's coming, if I qualified. And she says, and it's that uncertainty that is the hardest to deal with. And so it feels like that's kind of the ripple theme
for all of us in
for
this time.
everyone. Yeah.
And on the Department of Labor and the uncertainty, 2 weeks ago, I asked the speaker to ask the commissioner, do you think perhaps you could develop a flow chart about all the things that could happen and or go wrong as someone navigates the Department of Labor system, and what to do and how to know where you are in all of those situations? And she suggested to the commissioner. I have not seen said flow chart yet, but another House member and I are going to meet. Is today Friday? We're going to meet tomorrow, Saturday, to try to start developing that flow chart, because it's really that unknown is one of the hardest parts about this. It's the hardest part about navigating state systems under the best of circumstances. We never know what the future holds, but as humans, we like to forget that, because how else do we operate, right? And we're all so aware of it right now, and it makes everything, the tension.
How about for you, John? What are you seeing as far as the unknown, the lack of information? Where are you seeing that kind of squirrel things up, either in your own life or in your reporting life?
Well, I am relatively fortunate in that I still have a job, and my partner still has a job, so we are doing fine that way, and we have a house and all that stuff. But it's just, in terms of doing my job, it's harder to sort of get a handle on what's going on because you're not in the building. And a lot of what we do is we hang around in the building. You know, I spend most of my time in the State House cafeteria. You know, people come over and talk to me, or I snag people as they're walking by, because that's where everybody goes sooner or later. And it's creepy to hang out outside the bathroom. So it's...
lobbyists do that, though.
Well, they're a little bit creepier than the reporters, I hope. Anyway, that's a big part of what we do. That's like, you know, so what's going on? You know, that's a big question. I ask people, and people ask me too. And that's a big part of sort of the communication that goes on informally, and that isn't happening now. And, you know, people are available by phone, but that takes some conscious effort, which we don't always have time to do. In terms of lawmaking, it's, as Emilie said, it's all just completely up in the air. Emilie mentioned some of the bills that are almost certain to die, which means they'll have to start all over again in 2021. I would add to what she talked about, you know, Act 250 reform, which has been a huge workload for House Natural Resources.
Right.
The cannabis tax and regulate bill. There are a bunch of things. I would even point to something that I spent a little bit of time covering, a resolution to formally apologize for eugenic sterilizations, which would be the first time that Vermont has actually taken a stand on that, and actually, you know, acknowledged that this was a huge, terrible injustice that still has reverberations today, even though we like to think of it as something that happened long ago. And then there's the whole financial picture. We have no idea what it's going to look like. We have no idea what's going to happen. You know, just the other day, the head of the CDC said that we should be planning for a resurgence of COVID-19 this fall when it's flu season, and that might be even worse. And then, you know, there's a second shock wave in the economy, and there's a second wave, you know, self-quarantining effort. And then whatever the legislature does in August might be blown up completely. And then even if you assume that we get back to some semblance of normal, say next January, I think the agenda for the legislature and for the governor is going to be completely different by then, not only because of the immediate repercussions, but also, as you know, this has exposed a lot of the fault lines in our society, in our government, in our you know, economy. And I think that there's going to be a huge need for a different way of looking at things, from, you know, social services to healthcare to, you know, efforts to boost the economy might look completely different. And broadband is going to be a much bigger issue whenever we get back to normal.
Can I ask you about that, John? So, and thank you for highlighting that it's both the heavy lifts and the controversial issues that are sort of might fall into the dustbin. I think that's an important point. I'm really hopeful about what might be the future implications of these fault lines that have been revealed, because they're issues that have been important to me for a long time, and they're issues that I want to surface much more in the legislature, and I want broader understanding of. And yet I find myself really concerned about how we're going to navigate those really important, complex issues that now we have broader understanding of in an environment that I think is going to have a deep tendency to be operating from a place of scarcity and fear. And in the midst of all of that, what you were saying about the cafeteria and the hallways, we're all operating without the cafeteria and the hallways too.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And so the kind of creative conversations, the kind of cross-committee conversations, all of that is gone. And so how to even begin those processes of like navigating what the future might be and what creative thinking might be is just seems impossible in this environment, though I know we need to figure it out.
Yeah, and we are, I mean, we have been living through an age of sort of like belt tightening for a long time, and it's going to be a lot worse, no matter what happens with COVID-19, even if it just sort of goes away magically, as some in positions of authority have suggested. You know, this is just what we have gone through to this point is going to have deep economic reverberations for a long time. You know, you talk about like in Brattleboro, the small business community, the downtown, you know, what if half of the restaurants in Brattleboro don't survive this? You know, same thing in my town of Montpelier. You know, those small businesses that are the heart of our downtowns that make them such great places to go. You know, those people are struggling, and there's no way for them to make up for the loss of just being completely shut down for weeks or months. You know, and then, you know, if property values fall, then the education fund is imperiled. It's just, you know, and then you're trying to address these big structural issues with even fewer resources and uncertain resources. You know, this is going to be a huge challenge for folks like Emilie to deal with.
Yeah, both in your legislative job, but also your day job.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So on that note, we need to take a break for some of our underwriters. I hope, I just want to say this now, the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW-LP 107.7 Brattleboro really appreciates its underwriters. We haven't heard promos from them lately because of technical glitches on my side. So we're going to take a break, and hopefully there will be underwriters there. If there are not, please know, underwriters, we appreciate you. We will be back in a moment. Hello and welcome back to the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW-LP 107.7 Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I have with me Emilie Kornheiser as well as John Walters. And we just need to remind people, because we haven't, Emilie, in a long time.
Oh, we have not.
No, we have not. Because I'm so bad, I always think our listeners don't need to be reminded. But the views and opinions expressed on this show are ours and ours alone, and do not reflect the radio station. Remember that, John. Those are your opinions.
I am aware of that all the time.
So I want to, since we were talking a little bit about budget and, you know, the feeling of scarcity and the uncertainty that we're all feeling right now, I had a recent conversation with Lyle Holliday, the outgoing superintendent of the Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union. And she was talking about what the school system is going to do about students they haven't heard from at all. Because teachers have been trying to keep touches with students and families, but there's a handful that they have heard zilch from, and they don't know why. I mean, it could be everything from they're staying out of state with family to they're, you know, God forbid, they're all sick with COVID-19. Or I think this is one of Lyle's concerns too, there's something happening in the home that is not healthy right now. And that's why students are out of touch. And I think it highlights that whole issue right now of what can be happening around out of sight, out of mind, around things like domestic violence, child abuse, and what can that mean for the folks who are supposed to be supporting folks who need help at this time, in a time when we can't have direct contact.
I have an extra gig that I normally, on the pile of Vermonter gigs, where I have a private contract to facilitate the Wyndham Southeast Supervisory District's Attendance Council. And that's a monthly meeting where all of the school counselors, principals, vice principals, various folks from the whole school district or supervisory union come together and talk about how to support kids in getting to school. And the challenges of that, and how, family dynamics really, and whatever's going on in people's lives, make all the rest of everything else very difficult, and various strategies that schools use to engage with families in a way that's supportive rather than alienating, right? Because you want to be part of someone's life rather than an extra bridge to cross. And then parallel to that, been having great conversations with Representative Sibilia about, the technology gap. And that's actually especially the folks that we work with in Bellows Falls at Youth Services are experiencing a lot of technology gaps with accessing school. And so how that's a huge gap between families and the world right now, folks who don't have access to the internet or computers or technology. And just how all of this is really continuing to widen existing, we can call them achievement gaps, opportunity gaps, whatever they are. Some kids are going to do much better for this time away from school because they're going to have time now to go much deeper and focus more on things that interest them. And some kids are going to come out the other side of this with, many more challenges in entering the school system around behaviors and learning and habits and whatever else. And we are not set up to support families or kids in that holistically. We know there's probably a lot of domestic violence happening. Family Services, as a department or an agency in the Agency of Human Services, knows that reports are down, knows why reporting is down, has no illusions that there is less challenges with child protection right now, but really has no mechanisms or tools to be doing that sort of preventative work. They really entirely operate as an enforcement arm, and have, schools and doctors and other mandated reporters be sort of the eyes and ears of their system. And so from my perspective, this is a real opportunity to pivot how we do our work. But that takes, again, that creative thinking.
Yeah, the fact that mandated reporters are not seeing kids right now, by and large, means that there is almost certainly a crisis building in child abuse and probably in domestic violence. And we have seen indications that the suicide rate is up. Everything is basically, it's like a pot of soup that's boiling with a lid tamped down tightly on it. And we don't know what's happening under that lid right now. And it's even harder because of all the stresses of COVID. We are probably, whenever things do return to some semblance of normal, we are almost certainly going to see an explosion of need for social services of all kinds, and maybe even medical intervention. And the courts, if we have a wave of, child abuse and domestic violence that suddenly emerges, that's going to be one of the consequences of this pandemic. And we have no idea how big or how bad it's going to be.
And how we're going to be really clear right now that that's going to happen, and we're going to need the resources to tackle that on the other end.
Yeah.
Because we're seeing a lot of debate in the legislature around educational funding. And, from my perspective, it's essential that schools have even more funding next year to be able to tackle those challenges.
The teachers I spoke to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, John.
No, Um, yeah, I mean, schools are responsible for a lot of social services, and it's a lot of delivery of social services and watchdogging, and that's part of the reason that school budgets are higher than they used to be 20 or 30 years ago, because a lot of that burden has been shifted onto the schools. I also wanted to note that, there are a lot of kids for whom the home is not necessarily a safe haven.
A lot of humans.
Well, yes, but LGBTQ kids whose parents may not be accepting, and the only support they got was at school from their friends or from teachers or whatever, and kids with all sorts of other troubles that were getting some sort of management. Autistic kids, kids with any sort of learning challenge, were getting some measure of support at school, and they're not now. And that's part of the gap between the haves and the have-nots that you talked about, Emilie, getting worse right now.
Absolutely.
And again, we're going to see, maybe we'll have school in September, maybe we won't. Who knows when they'll be back in school again. And when they do return, it could be really bad for a long time.
The teachers I spoke to made it very clear that one of the things they're planning for when school does return into session is how, these students, we think automatically, gee, they've missed out on some academic time. But for these teachers, they're like, especially the ones for younger kids, where they have missed out on social time and they have missed out on community. And we're going to have to repair that and be prepared to actually support students who socially have been hurt by this time.
I want to highlight a sort of a public information note before we move on around queer kids and opportunities that are available during this time. A lot of the queer youth groups that operate at schools, some of them are still operating and available for any kids that want to sort of enter that virtual space. However, some of them are not able to operate because they don't have parents' permission. And so they were able to sort of make their way into those classrooms and opportunities while they were at school. But after school groups are held to sort of much stricter permissions around electronic communication. And so those are limited. There is a really great texting service that I saw out in the Open's Instagram feed, but I'm sure there's other places to find it. It's basically someone will sign up and someone will send you a daily or more than daily text that affirms your gender identity. For folks who are really like in a space in their home where people are denying their existence every day, to have that one lifeline. And so that's available for people Out in the Open's website or any other way to get in touch with Out in the Open.
Thank you, Emilie, for bringing that up.
It is heartening to see how many people in all walks of life have really stepped up to try to deal with the challenges that we're facing right now. From medical researchers to social service providers to teachers, restaurants that are providing food, all sorts of businesses and all sorts of individuals in all walks of life are really doing some incredible things. And, we and a lot of other media outlets are trying to report on stories of people who are doing great things, whether it's knitting masks or keeping in touch with students or whatever it is. There's a lot of really great stuff going on.
And I hope we can carry all of that great stuff into this new future, as well as sort of the other larger, more formal opportunities that we're going to need to fill.
Yeah. Well, and because I think this is really important to note now, to hold on to these moments of this is what wasn't working, this is how people solved it, because as Emilie has said more than once, we're going to need that creative thinking when we go back to quote unquote normal life. And we are kind of hitting that transition. The governor has issued a new executive order about reopening the economy. I personally have concerns about opening things too quickly, only because I don't want us to undo the good work we did at flattening that curve. That's a different conversation. But both Emilie and I, John, have found it very fascinating that the real estate market is one of the first things to start opening up again.
Mhm.
And we have talked on this show about, we have some communities that are heavily, their real estate market heavily relies on the second home market.
Yes.
And so Emilie and John, I'm wondering, have you been watching this? What are you thinking about real estate, property values? And are we going to see a blip in people who are like, I am done with the city. I'm not doing a pandemic in a city again. I am out of here.
Mhm.
All those implications. Have you guys been watching that?
So there's a few pieces of that for me. One, Vermont has been the apocalypse home for 100 years. I mean, that's essentially how the bulk of immigration into Vermont has happened. And we can, there are generations of different versions of that. There's generations of sort of utopian seeking and escapism. And, but that was all essentially, had an edge of apocalypse escape to it, or apocalypse planning. And so I want to name that this is a historic legacy of Vermont, not just like a new thing because of the pandemic. And we've branded ourselves that way.
Right. Well, and also, I mean, we've been having a lot of conversations before COVID about Vermont being a place for climate refugees in the future as well. So yeah, this is, Emilie, you're so right about that.
And so there's that piece of it that I don't want to let go of, that we're living with. And then there are all of the folks who maybe did not work remotely and now have learned that they can work remotely, right? And so that gives even more opportunities for people who might have wanted to move to Vermont and were living somewhere else and felt like they would never be able to find a way financially to have a career here, that now realize, or their employer realized, that, distance works. And that ties into the whole, strange Senate fixation on the remote worker and the incentives for the remote worker that we do not need to get into today. And so we have those two layers, right? Apocalypse home, remote worker, and then,
Well, and I'll add one more layer. We need more people to come to Vermont.
Indeed.
We need more jobs, and we need better paying jobs. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And there are, a lot of empty homes in Vermont, partly because, with the level of our wages and that incredible age of our real estate, most folks who live in Vermont and sort of know the score would never buy a 150-year-old farmhouse that needs $200,000 worth of work to be livable, right? Like, we're not gonna, I mean, I might have fallen for that, but like, we're not going to fall for that, right? I live in a primitive barn because I'm ridiculous and foolish. But so there's that piece too, that a lot of the property that's being purchased right now would not be necessarily purchased by a Vermonter anywhere close to its asking price because of how much profound money needs to be poured into it to make it livable. And so that leaves us open for a flood of humans. And what are the implications of that?
Well, it might be a flood of humans. It might also be a flood of empty houses that are owned as getaways by people in cities who rarely, if ever, use them. You could have a situation where, every house in Brattleboro, the price of every house in Brattleboro could rise. Half of them could be empty. People who actually live in Brattleboro would find the properties less affordable, and the businesses would not get any advantage because the people who own those houses are not here.
Yes.
That's one scenario. That's kind of the nightmare scenario, except that it would help the school district with property taxes.
Great for our tax base, terrible for our communities.
Yes, exactly. And those people, even if they spend, let's say generously, they spend a few weeks every year in that house, they're certainly not going to feel part of the community. And the community is not going to feel like they're part of that. So it's an interesting twist on this, and something that frankly I had not thought of because I live in Montpelier, and that sort of effect is a lot farther away. I think it's something it's not unique to southern Vermont, but the effects are going to mostly be felt in southern Vermont.
The other place that I've been really surprised as I've gotten to know legislators from the Northeast Kingdom is how huge a force that is there as well. And that's been really interesting to me. I think the difference is that in the kingdom, folks are much more used to not minding their neighbor's business. And so communities that are very sort of spread out and disconnected with everyone knowing each other still, can really, that dynamic can sustain through a flood of second homes. Whereas I think in southern Vermont, we have much more of an expectation of knowing our neighbors and being in relation with our neighbors rather than being in relation with the people you run into at the general store. And so I think that's one of the ways it's different in the kingdom, but still a real challenge around housing prices up there.
Yeah, let alone like ski towns, which are already suffering with like, you know, absentee ownership and Airbnb and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Chris Campany, the executive director of the Wyndham Regional Commission, has been sort of keeping an eye as well on some of the transportation changes and the kind of the expansion of rail service, because he says, you know, there's a very good chance that as far as southern Vermont's concerned, it could become a bedroom community for the more urban areas of Massachusetts. And what would that mean for our community? Could be good, could be, you know, who knows, but it's something that I'm not sure we as a community really think about. Like we think about it in very siloed terms, like, oh, it's ski area houses, or it's second homes or people who have fled the city, but we're not looking kind of holistically as like, what would this mean for our region?
One thing I've always been, sorry, John, go ahead.
The sort of like the extreme scenario of that is Vancouver, British Columbia. A lot of Chinese wealthy people from other areas of the world are buying homes in Vancouver in order to have a foothold in Canada in case they need to evacuate for whatever reason, in case they need a place to go. So housing prices are absolutely through the roof. They're astronomical in Vancouver. And a lot of neighborhoods are basically empty because people have bought these homes. It's cheap for somebody who's, you know, worth millions or billions to buy a house and then never use it. And that's what they're doing. And a lot of these houses are kind of falling apart. Nobody's mowing the lawn. Nobody's doing anything. And obviously nobody's involved in the community. And nobody who actually lives in Vancouver can afford to buy a house. I don't think that's ever going to happen in, you know, Brattleboro, but some very mild version of that could happen in Brattleboro.
You know, it's so interesting, John, when I was living in London in 2008, 2009, they were having similar conversations because something in a lot of neighborhoods, the same thing had happened, that folks from overseas had bought these houses so they would have a foothold, but then no one's there and they're falling apart. And of course, London at the time was having a real crunch on rental markets. They needed more rental properties.
And we already have that to some degree here. And it hasn't led to gentrification per se, but it has led to really a very divided real estate market where sort of the middle doesn't exist and is not available to families who want to purchase homes and then free up other homes for rentals. And so as that goes further, if that goes further, we're going to have to be really careful about, you know, not further growing, you know, so simultaneous to that, we have this increased awareness of the fact that, like, you know, people need housing to be safe, right? Probably should have understood that before, but it seems like we're like really clear on that now. And so want to make sure that we're not losing that thread and not keeping that thread separate from the real estate speculation thread, because they are, so, you know, it is all one system. I'm really, you know, the Bellows Falls Police Department, this is sort of a funny little tweak fact, but the Bellows Falls Police Department, to work there, you're required to live within Rockingham. And
interesting.
It's mostly around on-call and making sure that folks who are on call can get to a site in time. It's not about community policing and the original development of the policy. But I think there are really interesting implications for it when we think about service provision and community engagement in Brattleboro or in Wyndham County, and living in sort of this tri-state area. And if folks can't afford to live in the community that they're working in, what that means for how services are provided and how people understand the communities that they're serving. If folks can't, if folks are sort of seeking Brattleboro area jobs and living elsewhere, what that does. And we already see that a lot of the folks who work in service provision in Brattleboro might live over the border in New Hampshire or in Massachusetts and be commuting. And it just creates it's a very different identity and a very different sort of set of hustle that people go through.
Mm-hmm.
And a very different volunteer base.
Yes.
Yes. Well, and it's a good thing to note too, just on the ripple effect. If we want a community where people, and I know we talk about this in Brattleboro a lot, where people are biking to work, walking to work, whatever, if people can't actually afford to live in their community where they work, then guess what? They're probably not going to be biking or walking. They're probably going to be driving.
Yep.
Absolutely. And, we had a meeting of the Climate Caucus yesterday, and we were talking about sort of what, globally, I think we're spending a lot of time talking about what we've learned about climate change and our potential for climate change action based on this new time in our lives. And sort of, we've seen the canal. I don't know if everyone has seen the videos of the canals in Venice and how they're healthy again. It's inspiring, right? It's inspiring. It's sad and inspiring, and that we have less cars on the roads because people aren't going anywhere, which I actually haven't noticed a big reduction in cars on the road in Brattleboro. But how we can sort of sustain the good parts of that, right, while still making sure people are, getting their basic needs met, which I don't think is necessarily true right now while the cars are slowed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Emilie.
Yeah.
We are coming close to the end of time. But I know it went like boom.
There was a way you said that it sounded like we were like at end times, not the end of our time.
It sometimes feels that way. But I want to come back to a conversation that we were having before we started the recording going, because I think in this cycle of COVID, we're all going through these collective emotions. I think there was fear and grief at the beginning. And now, I don't know about you folks, but I am going through this general sense of just overwhelm, especially with details. Like, I just can't make another decision. And I'm wondering if you are feeling this.
I think everybody is under unusual and sometimes subtle pressures. Just because, a lot of people are, have job insecurity, or they've lost their jobs, or they don't have a safe place to live. And for them, the stresses are obvious and overwhelming. But every little thing we do every day is more stressful and just different than it used to be. I actually kind of I think about making sure we have enough eggs in the house in a way that I never did before. You go to a store and you see some of the shelves are almost empty, and you're really tempted to grab whatever it is that's there's 3 boxes left of, even if you don't usually use it. And, and being on Zoom calls and, Facebook chats all the time, every little thing we do is different and more stressful, and we are all out of our comfort zone. Mm-hmm. And that takes its toll over time. That's why we see, some people saying, open things up, let us out of our houses, I need a haircut, all that stuff, which sounds stupid, but really it's reflecting a basic human need for, the regularity of daily life, and we don't have that now.
Mm-hmm.
I find that the places, all of those things, all of the stresses being more heightened, being aware that I also have sort of a narrative that I don't deserve to acknowledge my stress because I have a salaried job and I'm really busy. And then there's sort of the third level, which is, it feels like a very female middle-class Southern Vermont lady thing of everyone else is baking sourdough bread and I don't have time to, which is such an absurd thing for me to be wasting any emotional energy on. And then I find that the places that I usually refill my well are not available to me right now, and I need to find new
Yeah.
places for them. And so some of the sociality, but more of that for me is creative, intellectual spaces, and doing that with other people. And those kinds of conversations that creative space feels very unavailable to me right now. And that's where I fill my well from all of the other sort of tedium of policy. It's the creative piece of policy that's so fulfilling to me, and that's not available. And so all the other things have trouble balancing out. While I love eating lunch at home so much, it's the best. But I also have, the time I'm spending with family is time that during the normal legislative session, I spend working 12, 14, 18-hour days up in Montpelier. And I can't work an 18-hour day in my house in Brattleboro because my family will riot. And so that's also a really sort of interesting piece to all of this, is that one of those shifts in what family time looks like, that I find both stressful and beautiful.
I hope we're all finding ways to document this time and all its nuances, so that it is, in the long term, it will be something more than just the time we all didn't get to talk to each other. Yeah.
When you say that, I think, oh no, that's another pressure on myself that I'm not fulfilling right now. So I want to say that, I really think that that's both of your job and not my job. Thank you. Yeah. And two,
I was actually thinking of journaling. I wasn't thinking of something formal.
The Vermont Historical Society is doing a really cool StoryCorps kind of project related to that I think people should know about, that you can find on their website or various ways that they're communicating. So that's another sort of more personal piece of that. Rumble Strip, which is one of my favorite podcasts, is also doing some really cool pieces on that.
Yeah.
Well, anything you wanted to add or wish I had asked before we sign off?
The whole thing is so overwhelming, when you sit down and think about all the challenges that we face. It is really stunning, and we have no idea what the universe is going to look like in 2 months, let alone 6 months or a year or 5 years. On the other hand, when I talk to people, they talk about the challenges, and they also talk about how Vermonters are responding. And I know I talked about this earlier, but it's worth repeating that we are discovering, areas of strength in ourselves that we didn't need to tap before, and now we need it. And we are finding that, especially in a lot of our smaller communities, that there is this strength of community that doesn't exist in big cities, that is a tremendous asset. There are great things about Vermont, and there are great things that Vermonters in all areas of life are doing right now. And that's an important thing to realize, even as we are facing all the stresses and the difficulties and the social, earth-shaking issues, is that we are all finding ways to respond and deal with and help other people. And that's important to remember as well.
Absolutely. We are so resilient and creative and generous, and I am very hopeful that we can build policies and governance from that place of resilience and creativity and generosity, and that we find space for that in the months ahead.
Well, thank you to both of you. I have to say, I am so grateful for this podcast and for all the people who have participated in it, because this space for conversation, I think that's one of the blessings of COVID, is some of us are experiencing challenges perhaps we never had before. And yet they're challenges that many people have in their everyday life. And I think it will change conversations going forward. So Representative Emilie Kornheiser, thank you for joining us. John Walters of Vermont Digger, thank you for joining us. John, if people want to read your articles, where can they find them?
Well, the site is vtdigger.org. I will also mention a daily email service that we do. It's called Final Reading, and you can sign up for it on our website, vtdigger.org. It's sort of a roundup of everything that's happened legislatively on legislative work days. It's free. You just have to, provide an email address for us to send it to you. So that's where you can find me.
Thank you. Emilie?
EmilieKornheiser.org, eKornheiser@gmail, eKornheiser@ledge.state.vt.us. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, or not really Twitter, though I try. And every Saturday at 9 a.m. for the foreseeable future, all of the Brattleboro state representatives, myself, Tristan Tolino, and Molly Burke, are holding a virtual coffee hour. And so folks can find access to that virtual meeting room via Front Porch Forum, or there's a Facebook event on my legislative Facebook page, or just get in touch and I'll send you a link.
Thank you.
Can I leave you with the funniest thing I saw on Zoom this week?
Oh, please do.
Please.
It was a Senate committee hearing, and your colleague Jeanette White was one of the members of the committee. So there she is on Zoom. And she didn't realize it, but she had her notepad right in front of her phone, and she started taking notes, and suddenly there was this pen going across the screen. And at first I didn't know what it was. It was like this giant object that suddenly like dancing across the screen, and then I realized she's taking notes. So be aware of what you're doing when you're on Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is such good advice. Thank you everyone for joining us for this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour. I'm your host, Olga Peters. You can find us on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, at 2 on Friday afternoons, or as well at the Vermontitude SoundCloud page and the Vermontitude Facebook page. Have a great weekend, everyone.